Hi, I am SB sir, and today I'll teach you the basics of oxygenation of blood or oxygenation of our body, which takes place through lungs. You know, our body consumes oxygen, and every minute we consume around 250 ml, 250 ml of Coca-Cola bottle, 250 ml of oxygen, 250 ml. Just to make you remember, it is just 250 ml. It's a Coca-Cola bottle that we consume every minute at rest. And this kind of how do we derive, how have we calculated this amount of oxygen, that I will come later. How did we know that this is the amount of oxygen that we consume? I will come to that later. And our body, the specialized organ for oxygenation that we know, our lungs, that the lungs are very vascular tissues. Vascular tissues means the air comes inside the lungs, blood comes inside the lungs, and then blood mixes with oxygen and goes to the body, the whole body, by the arteries. It gets distributed throughout the body. So by the lungs is the organ for oxygenation. This addition of oxygen in our body takes place in the lungs, and this amount of oxygenation is there. And who is the molecule which takes up this oxygen? It is majorly the hemoglobin molecule. So it's a very important molecule for our body, because it carries oxygen, it holds oxygen, it has a very high affinity for oxygen, and that's why it is so important that you have proper concentration of hemoglobin. And they call it that, always they call it by percentage, Hb percentage. Say if the Hb percentage goes around 10%, we call them anemic. We call persons anemic. If there are severe cases of anemia, it goes down to 6 to 7%. So what does this percentage mean? It means that Hb, the hemoglobin which is present, where is hemoglobin present? Hemoglobin is present inside the RBCs. I draw RBC here, and here the hemoglobins are present. All hemoglobins are present here. So hemoglobin, RBCs are basically hemoglobin packets. And if you contain less concentration of hemoglobin here, if the RBCs contain less concentration of hemoglobin here, then we say it that the hemoglobin percentage of blood is decreased. So when they calculate this hemoglobin percent, they rupture this RBC. So the hemoglobin goes out, and then that hemoglobin is measured. They rupture this RBC. The pores develop. They rupture this RBC, the hemoglobin goes out of the RBC, and they measure the hemoglobin content of the blood. But hemoglobin is present inside the RBC, and how much hemoglobin is present? It is around the normal for men is around 13 to 15%. The normal for women is around 12%. Now, what is this percentage denote? Percentage denote that this amount, say 13 grams in 100 ml blood. 100 ml that we know, 1 deciliter. So in those reports, in those laboratory reports, in those diagnostic reports, you get 13 gram percent or 13 gram per DL. It's written like this. So in 100 ml blood means close to a very small cup holds 100 ml of tea. In 100 ml of that cup, you contain the hemoglobin. The amount of hemoglobin is 13 grams. So 13 to 15 gram percent is the amount of hemoglobin that is present inside the RBCs. And you know, so I'll quickly rub this out, and I'll go to the details of that. Say 13 gram percent is present in our blood. So, and the hemoglobin molecules carry oxygen. So how much oxygen hemoglobin this hemoglobin molecules can carry? Say 1 gram of hemoglobin 1 gram of hemoglobin, HGB, I am writing it in short, 1 gram of hemoglobin can carry 1.34 ml of milliliter of oxygen. So if our body has 5 liters of blood, so 5 liters of blood means 5000 ml. 5000 ml, and 5000 ml means every 100 ml, out of this every 100 into 50. I just told you that every 100 ml of blood contains 13 grams of hemoglobin. So 50 into 100 is 5000 ml, 5 liters of blood. So 50 into 100 is 5 liters of blood, and every 100 ml, in that every 100 ml contains 13 grams. 13 grams percent means every 100 ml, this percentage means every 100 ml, I remove this percent because in every 100 ml I have written 13 grams. So 13 grams into 50 times of it is 50 times of this 100 ml makes 5 liters of blood, 5 liters of our blood that we have inside our body. So the hemoglobin content is around 650 to 13 into 5 is 650 grams to 700 grams. If it is say more than 13 gram person, so it can become 700, it can become 750 grams. So you can remember it in this way. If it is 15 grams, 15 into 50, it is 750 grams. So this is the amount of hemoglobin that we have in our body inside the RBCs. So RBCs are the packets of hemoglobin, and this hemoglobin is required for carrying oxygen, and 1 gram of hemoglobin can carry 1.34 ml of oxygen. Now, why is this molecule present inside our blood? Why is this hemoglobin molecule present inside our blood? Because it's a molecule which has a very high affinity for oxygen. It's a molecule which has a very high affinity, and it can hold oxygen. But now there is a question. If somebody holds something very strongly, so he will not release that thing. Say I put some 1000 rupee note in your hand, and you consider it as something very great, so you will not lose that, you will hold it tightly. But if you want to be a molecule of very versatile nature, so hemoglobin is not like that. Hemoglobin binds oxygen very tightly, but the problem here is why do we require hemoglobin? What do we require from hemoglobin? Our body requires what? Our body requires that hemoglobin carries the oxygen from the lung, and then if you carry the molecule to our body, inside our body from the lungs, you have to deliver that oxygen also. So the hemoglobin molecule which was carrying oxygen, now it has to deliver also. First thing is that it is now oxygen is bound in the lungs, and now, but the hemoglobin has to deliver this oxygen into the tissues. So in the lungs this oxygenation takes place, but in the tissues this deoxygenation also has to happen. And because this deoxygenation has to happen, hemoglobin becomes a molecule who will hold it in some conditions in the lungs and release it in some conditions. The conditions will tell hemoglobin, the conditions inside the lungs will tell hemoglobin, come on, in this condition you are now to bind the oxygen. And the tissues, the hemoglobin, here the oxygen is bound. The hemoglobin gets bound to oxygen, and this hemoglobin runs back because the heart pumps out this oxygenated blood to the whole of the body. You know that the right heart pumps out the blood to the lungs, and the left heart pumps out the blood to the whole body. So this left heart is we see this. These are the two auricles, two ventricles. If you just remember, this is the left heart. This is the ventricle, this is the auricle, this is the right heart, this is the right auricle. So whole of our body receives blood from the heart. The right heart receives the blood from the whole of our body, and this blood then, by the contraction of these ventricles, gets pumped out by the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. Now the lungs returns this blood to the heart. The lungs returns this blood to the heart after the oxygenation, and this blood comes to the left heart, the oxygenated blood and the deoxygenated. The blood here goes to the lungs to get deoxygenated. It releases the carbon dioxide of the whole body. This blood is coming to the right heart. This blood is coming to the right heart to get released into the lung, and this blood is full of carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide is released in the lung, and oxygen is added in the lungs, and this oxygenated blood comes to the left heart to the left ventricle, and then it gets released to the whole of our body. So inside the lung there are two things that happen. One is oxygenation that I just mentioned. Oxygen gets added into the lung and carbon dioxide gets removed from the blood. Now, how is this carbon dioxide removal take place? Carbon dioxide removal takes place inside the lung. The blood that comes to the lung from the whole body comes from the right heart, and the blood which comes to which returns from the lung is basically a decarboxylated blood, or carbon dioxide is removed and oxygenated blood. That means oxygen is added to this blood. Now there are two processes that is taking place in the lungs. One is carbon dioxide removal, another is oxygenation. Now I will have to go into the details of these processes and how these two things are interrelated. The relation between carbon dioxide removal and oxygen addition. Now I will explain those things. These things actually fall into gas transport. Why it is transport? It is because these gases, gas transport is why it is called transport, because there are two gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. There are two types. These are the two types of transport, and it is just the reverse. The oxygen gets added in the lungs and released in the tissue, and the carbon dioxide gets added in the tissues. The tissues produce carbon dioxide, your muscles produce carbon dioxide, your organs produce carbon dioxide, and then it gets added there in the blood, in the organs, in the whole body. The whole body adds carbon dioxide to the blood in the organs, in the different organs of our body. The muscles work, the digestive systems work, the brain work, all the systems and the organs of our body produces carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide gets added to the blood in the tissues, and this blood is returned to the heart, and then the carbon dioxide is removed from our body in the lungs. So just the reverse, the carbon dioxide is added to the blood in the lungs, and carbon dioxide is removed in the lungs. So what is the speciality of the lungs? That it can up to now we have known that lungs is an organ of gaseous exchange. Now what is that exchange? How this lung becomes so specialized for exchange? Exchange means two types of blood gases. One is living out of the body in the lungs, carbon dioxide living out of the body to the lungs, and it gets deposited in the alveoli, and we breathe out those gases. The carbon dioxide living out of the body and gets liberated in the air. The plants taking carbon dioxide to produce glucose. So it is of no requirement of our body. We cannot do any kind of photosynthesis. So we only produce carbon dioxide, and we produce carbon dioxide and we liberate it from the lungs, and we take in oxygen. We take in oxygen because oxygen is a gas which undergoes aerobic metabolism, and through aerobic metabolism oxygen produces ATP in the mitochondria. So basically mitochondria is an organelle because it's present inside the cells, and the presence of this organelle actually tells our body, come on, we are here to use up oxygen. You deliver us oxygen. Mitochondria tells the whole body tissues, all the cells of our body, come on, we are present, we can use oxygen. You deliver us oxygen, I'll deliver you ATP. So ATP, and we require this ATP very dearly. We require ATP very dearly because all our muscular processes, all our secretions, all our proteins will not get synthesized unless we have ATP. This is a kind of petrol to the car. This is a kind of food to our body. Without ATP, our body will get weak and weak. So it's an energy currency. It is produced by the mitochondria. By using up oxygen, mitochondria produces ATP. And how this is produced, I'll just hint out there, because we have seen that there are various metabolic processes right from our childhood. We have seen there are various metabolic processes which produces NADH2, and this NADH2 has huge amount of energy, and this energy in this NADH2, I am radiating lines because this just like the sun getting huge amount of energy. It has huge amount of energy, and what this mitochondria does is that it takes out those energies and the hydrogen atoms and delivers that to the oxygen atoms. When the energy gets liberated, this energy produces ATP. And when these electrons, I'll draw the electrons in a different color. When these electrons and the protons of hydrogen, the hydrogen H plus and E gets liberated, the energy and the H plus E both gets liberated simultaneously. And this H plus E, the electrons are added to the oxygen, which I'll write it by blue. Why? Because this is the molecule. Why do we require oxygen? Because unless and until oxygen is present, unless and until you have oxygen, you will not be releasing. The blue is not working, so I'll write it in green. Unless and until you have this, green is also a very good color because we get oxygen from plants, and so this hydrogen and electrons, oxygen is the electron acceptor of this hydrogen and electrons from this NADH. This NADH liberates hydrogen and electrons inside the mitochondrial outer membranes, and these hydrogen and electrons gets transferred to oxygen, and so the NADH2 can liberate its energy. These are the energy molecules. These are the energy molecules from where these are the energy molecules from where we synthesize ATP. So with this little bit introduction, why do we require oxygen? We require oxygen just because we need more ATP. And why ATP is required? Because we can produce NADH plus H plus in various metabolic pathways, and those NADHs that are produced, they are very high energy molecules. We get NADH from large complex molecules, breaking down large complex molecules like glucose, etc. I'm not going into details. And those NADH2 are now fully loaded with energy. They come to the mitochondria. Come on, let us release our energy to produce ATP. The mitochondria transfers the energy. It transfers the energy to ATP, and by when it transfers the energy to the ATP, what happens is that there are few electrons. While this energy is getting out of this NADH2, there are few electrons and hydrogen that has to get out of this NADH. These electrons and hydrogen, unless and until oxygen is present, you will not be able to take up these hydrogen and electrons. So oxygen takes up these hydrogen and electrons to get converted into water, and so this liberation of energy can take place, and this is called aerobic metabolism that happens in the mitochondria. So so today what we will this was a little subsection of why do we require oxygen. Now I'll go to the main part of the teaching today. The main part of the teaching today was oxygen and gas transport, oxygen carbon dioxide transport and gas transport. Now I'll come to that. It's a very interesting thing because gas transport is actually a kind of symbiotic thing, because each gas, oxygen helps in carbon dioxide liberation, and carbon dioxide helps in oxygen liberation. How does that take place? Now it's a little bit complex, and the logics are also a little bit complex, but actually if nothing is complex, then it's not interesting also. If it is interesting, it will have some logic, and I'll go to those logics now. Let us assume that hemoglobin becomes a very strong molecule and it will bind oxygen and it will not release oxygen. So hemoglobin molecule is of no use, because if it binds oxygen and does not release oxygen to the tissues, as happens if there is a carbon monoxide poisoning, the carbon monoxide poisoning renders hemoglobin structure such a way that it will bind oxygen and it will not release that oxygen. So we will not be able to release that oxygen. Hemoglobin will not be able to release that oxygen in the tissues, and it will not be a transport, it will be holding of oxygen. Transport means that hemoglobin will take up the oxygen, deliver it to the tissues. Again go to the lungs, take up the oxygen, deliver it into the tissues. This is called transport. So oxygen transport molecule is hemoglobin because it can bind, it can release, it can bind, it can release. Similarly, there are carbon dioxide transport mechanisms which are independent of hemoglobin, because carbon dioxide is a gas which is transported in blood, not in the hemoglobin. So if somebody says you that okay, I have hemoglobin, so I have good gaseous exchange. Hemoglobin helps only in oxygen transport. To some extent it helps in carbon dioxide transport also, but majorly carbon dioxide is transported in the blood. Carbon dioxide is transported in the blood in the form of acid which we called H2CO3. Now how this H2CO3 is formed? It forms by the reaction of water addition to carbon dioxide. And who does this? An enzyme which is called carbonic anhydrase. I'll explain this action of this enzyme carbonic anhydrase in a different class. It is also a very interesting process of this water addition to this carbon dioxide. This water addition to this carbon dioxide forms this acid H2CO3. H2CO2 plus O, oxygen, and it becomes bicarbonic acid. Or carbonic acid. This H2CO3 is a weak acid, as we know, weak acid. So this H2CO3 formation takes place inside the RBCs, where you have plenty of carbonic anhydrase. plenty of carbonic anhydrase. This enzyme is there and they will give you H2CO3. When carbon dioxide is added in the blood, it will take up all those carbon dioxides and it will form H2CO3. H2CO3. So the RBCs now can have carbon dioxide loaded in them. It will liberate that carbon dioxide into the plasma also, because we know our blood is 45% the volume of RBC. RBCs take up 45% of our blood volume and the plasma is 55%, and that is called the hematocrit. Plasma is the water part of our blood and this is the cellular part of our, the volume by volumes 45% is RBC. So if some carbon dioxide now enters the blood and it gets delivered into the RBCs and H2CO3 is formed, that has to, because this is 45% of the volume, so it has to be going out of this RBC and get released in the plasma, so that the whole blood can now distribute that amount of H2CO3 in its whole volume, so that the concentration of our carbon dioxide doesn't get so much increased inside the RBCs and it gets distributed to the whole volume of blood. So that also takes place, and in case carbon dioxide is transported by the whole blood, whereas oxygen is transported only by the majorly by the RBCs, because hemoglobin is present. So the most important molecule for oxygen transport is hemoglobin, whereas the most important molecule for carbon dioxide addition is carbonic anhydrase, this enzyme which is present inside the RBCs. Now what happens when this carbon dioxide addition takes place? Now when this carbon dioxide addition takes place, this now can ionize into H plus and HCO3 minus. These are two ions. Because it's an acid, it gets hydrated and it gets hydrated into ions. It liberates hydrogen ions. Because it's an acid, it liberates hydrogen ions in the solution and it ionizes to H plus and HCO3 ions in the solution, in a watery solution. Now, if this ionization takes place, this ion, this negative bicarbonate ion, can be taken up by different minerals in the blood, by sodium. The sodium releases its chlorine to get converted into NaHCO3. Potassium releases its chlorine to bind to HCO3. So different salts are produced inside this in our blood, and different and carbon dioxide is carried. So more it ionizes, more it can get converted to different types of salts, and more amount of carbon dioxide addition can take place. So this ionization actually helps our blood to deposit more carbon dioxide. But when this happens in our blood, that more this H2CO3 is an acid producing gas, it will produce these ions, and these ions will get converted to salts, because as you know that this bicarbonate ion gets converted to different salts, and this AgB has to get buffered. Has to get buffered, because too much of H plus is not good, because it lowers the pH of the blood. So it has to get buffered. So that is a question. How does it get buffered? And this bicarbonate addition and this formation of salts to neutralize this ionization, so that this process gets converted in this direction. Process moves to this direction, and more carbon dioxide gets added to the blood. So that we can release that carbon dioxide off. We can transport. The major form of carbon dioxide transport in the blood is bicarbonate ions. Remember, carbon dioxide is highly soluble in water. It is soluble more than oxygen 20 times. It is 20 times more soluble in water. Carbon dioxide is 20 times more soluble in water. So you find carbon dioxide granules, dissolved carbon dioxide more in water than oxygen, because it's 20 times more more soluble. The gas is 20 times more soluble in water. So so there are different processes. Oxygen doesn't get dissolved in the blood. It's a very difficult to thing, and the fishes always because if the water doesn't contain algae, green red algae, those produces, if sunlight doesn't fall on the water and the plants don't produce oxygen, fishes will simply get the fishes that are present inside the pond will not get oxygen, because oxygen can't get dissolved. The plants inside those ponds, those ponds will produces oxygen when sunlight falls on the water, and then the oxygen bubbles get out and the fishes get those oxygen. Now, but if you bubble carbon dioxide inside that water, water will hold carbon dioxide more, because it is 20 times more soluble in water. So carbon dioxide in the blood also, carbon dioxide is carried in a much larger fraction than oxygen in dissolved form. In dissolved form, carbon dioxide is carried in much larger fraction in dissolved form than oxygen. So I'll go to those fractions, to those percentages in later, when you have to remember those percentages, those fractions. I'll let you remember, I'll make you memorize those things, but now I'll go to the logic. So if the blood has to load carbon dioxide, it has to ionize. This H2CO3 has to ionize, and it gets distributed throughout the blood, and it gets to get distributed in the RBCs as well as plasma, and this is the major form of carbon dioxide transport, means addition of carbon dioxide. Now what happens inside the lungs? Inside the lungs there is a cooling effect. There is a cooling effect, and because oxygen is an alkali producing gas, the pH becomes more in the compared to the body tissues. Inside our body tissues, the pH is acidic. The pH is acidic. The pH falls. It falls to an acidic range, and in the lung the pH rises. That means the pH value rises. That means lung are a little bit more alkaline in nature. Lungs are the little bit more alkaline in nature than body tissues and muscles. Lungs are more alkaline in nature. So this property, this change of environment, at the same time lungs are little bit colder, because lungs, we take in more air from outside, and our body temperature is 37 degree, and the air outside is always cooler than 37 degree. So our lungs is always a little bit cold organ than the whole of our body. Inside our body there are muscle actions, there are different types of metabolism going on, and the body, and it produces body heat, and our body, we know that body heat is 37 degree temperature. Our body stays at 37 degree temperature. So our lungs are a little bit cooler than our body. Lungs are cooler. So there is a change in environment in the lungs. It's an alkaline tissue. It's a much cooler cooler organ than other tissues. Now in this changed condition, what happens is that carbon dioxide is released from the blood. And why this carbon dioxide is released from the blood? The reverse process takes place. All the bicarbonate ions the bicarbonate ions are there, binds to oxygen. You find more oxygens in more hydrogens, so that the bicarbonate ions find more hydrogens to get converted into H2CO3, and this H2CO3 gets broken down into H2O and CO2, and this carbon dioxide is released from the lungs. So the body takes in the carbon dioxide, forms H2CO3, ionizes them in the tissues, carries them into the blood, and then this blood, which has these bicarbonate ions, get into the lung to get a complete different action, in just the reverse. The carbon dioxide getting released as a gas, and this carbon dioxide is getting released as a gas inside the lungs, and we liberate that carbon dioxide. So why does this take place? I'll go to the logic of that. Because in the lungs, what happens is that hemoglobin, there is hemoglobin in the RBCs, Now hemoglobin has two forms. Hemoglobin, you know that oxygen can bind to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin has two forms. It is the free hemoglobin and the hemoglobin that is bound to oxygen. Now the blood that comes into the lungs gets oxygenated, and this oxygenated blood, the oxygen added blood is a stronger, this oxygen added hemoglobin is a stronger acid. And you know that when it's a stronger acid, I am telling you that hemoglobin bound to oxygen is a stronger acid. I am not making any mistake. You have to remember this, that it behaves as a, because you know all these protein molecules present inside our body are actual buffers. And what buffers can do, it can hold oxygen, it can release oxygen, it can hold hydrogen, it can release hydrogen. I'm sorry that I have told oxygen. Buffers are there to somehow manage the hydrogens, manage the protons in a solution. It will at times liberate protons, at times in a different condition it will hold up protons. So buffers actually don't change the pH, and hemoglobin is a buffer, and buffers are actually a kind of acids because it can release a hydrogen, it can at the same time hold up the hydrogen. So if this hemoglobin molecule is holding hydrogen, if it becomes a stronger acid, it will no longer hold hydrogen, it will liberate the hydrogen. It will liberate this hydrogen, and this, when hydrogen liberation takes place, because the oxygen added form of hemoglobin is stronger, its acidity, the acidity of AgBO2 is more than Hb. This you have to remember. And when the acidity increases, this hemoglobin holds up numerous hydrogens, and these hydrogens are getting liberated from this hemoglobin, because there are different amino acids which are holding hydrogens. You know, amino acids can hold hydrogen. Hemoglobin is a protein, and it will hold hydrogen in those amino acids, and those hydrogens are getting liberated, because it becomes a strong acid, and these hydrogens are now finding these bicarbonates and getting converted to H2CO3, and this carbon dioxide is released. So what has happened? Hey, come on, oxygen addition to the hemoglobin, oxygen addition in the hemoglobin is release the carbon dioxide from our blood. Because oxygen addition makes hemoglobin a stronger acid, and this stronger acid will liberate more H plus ions, and this H plus ion will now find those bicarbonate ions, and these bicarbonate ions gets combined together, and this carbon dioxide. So all these bicarbonates that are produced inside the blood while the blood was carrying carbon dioxide is getting released. It's getting released to carbon dioxide, and carbon dioxide getting released into the air, into the alveolar air. And so we can liberate carbon dioxide. So we find some kind of cooperative process. Come on, oxygen is helping hemoglobin. Oxygen by its addition to hemoglobin is helping hemoglobin to release hydrogens, and these hydrogens participating in bicarbonate release, and carbon dioxide is getting released. So oxygen helping carbon dioxide release. Now we will see how this carbon dioxide helps oxygen release. Carbon dioxide inside the tissues, inside our tissues we have various metabolic processes, and all those metabolic processes produces carbon dioxide. You have seen that various enzymes are decarboxylases, and all those decarboxylases produce histidine decarboxylase, this decarboxylase, that decarboxylase. All those decarboxylation reactions taking place in the metabolism have carbon dioxide release, and this carbon dioxide release is actually in the tissues, and tissues with those metabolisms make huge amount of carbon dioxide, and this carbon dioxide has to release. Now we will see what the tissues, this is what the lungs does to the carbon dioxide. The lungs with its oxygenation, the hemoglobin with its oxygenation does to the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide gets released. Now we will see just the reverse. The carbon dioxide of the tissues telling hemoglobin, come on, release your oxygen, come on, release your oxygen, liberate into the tissue so that we can get that oxygen and produce ATP in the mitochondria. So oxygen addition in the blood helping in carbon dioxide release. Now we will know how carbon dioxide present inside the tissues will help in hemoglobin in the oxygen release. It will help hemoglobin to release its oxygen in the tissues so that our body can feed on that oxygen. Our body can get that oxygen. Now what happens is that inside our body, when the hemoglobin arrives with all its oxygen inside our tissues, what happens? I'll explain that. So when the blood comes to the tissues with all its oxygen, the hemoglobin in HbO2 comes in an environment where there is huge amount of H plus ions, because we know that tissues are always acidic, lung is alkaline and tissues are always acidic, H plus ions. Now this H plus ions will bind to this hemoglobin, and this drop in pH means this acidic pH helps this because in the tissues what there is carbon dioxide, there is, from this carbon dioxide you find H2CO3, and this H2CO3 has ionized to make H plus and CO3 minus, HCO3 minus, and this HCO3 is present inside the tissues, and this hemoglobin is finding all these hydrogen ions, and inside the tissues there are huge amount of at the same time with the presence of these hydrogen ions there is a much larger temperature also. The temperature is also high, the tissues are relatively hotter, relatively warmer than the lungs. So the hemoglobin that is bound to oxygen is facing these conditions, and in these conditions it will now release oxygen. It stays no longer, the hemoglobin will now get converted into a molecule which is called Hb, because hemoglobin with these hydrogen additions, the hydrogens will bind to several areas of hemoglobin molecule of these proteins, and it will now get loaded with hydrogen, to become HHB. It is an excellent buffer. Because it will bind all those hydrogens, and now this hemoglobin will no longer be able to bind oxygen, and it will release all its oxygen. to the tissues. So in the tissues, this effect of the tissues means the tissues with all its hydrogen ions getting bound, as on the hemoglobin molecule. The hydrogens are getting painted on the hemoglobin molecule. Painting of hydrogen in the hemoglobin molecule will tell hemoglobin, come on, you now have to lose oxygen, and the oxygen is now delivered to the tissues. The oxygen is now delivered, and this effect is called Bohr effect. Scientist Bohr, B-O-H-R, Bohr effect. Why this is called Bohr effect? Because this effect is because of the presence of carbon dioxide and pH and temperature. All these things will now tell hemoglobin, come on, lose your oxygen, come on, lose your oxygen, and the hemoglobin molecule will not be able to keep up that oxygen, will not be able to hold up that oxygen, and it will release that oxygen from its body to the tissues, and the oxygen gets available for the tissues, gets available to get diffused into the tissues of our body, and this effect is called Bohr effect. So carbon dioxide in the tissues is letting hemoglobin lose its oxygen. This is another kind of cooperation between these two gases. So carbon dioxide, earlier what you remember, what we learned is that the carbon dioxide release is because of the addition of in the lungs. The carbon dioxide that was released from the blood is because of the addition of oxygen, and now we learned that the oxygen release from inside the tissues, the hemoglobin that has arrived from the lung in the tissues, it has come from the lungs with oxygenated hemoglobin that has come from the lungs, liberates its oxygen. I cannot hold its oxygen because the tissues through its hydrogens have told the hemoglobin, come on, release. So it is the tissues, the change of environment in the tissues, that the hemoglobin can no longer bind to the oxygen, and the change of environment in the lung that happened because that oxygen was an alkaline gas, addition of oxygen, temperature, the increase of pH in the lung, all those change of environment in the lung had told the lung tissues with all its environmental changes had told the carbon dioxide, come on, get liberated, we are supplying you with all those hydrogen ions now, come on, leave, and the carbon dioxide gets converted to CO2 and water instead of getting dissolved by all those bicarbonates and those carbonic acids. Now the reverse process had turned on and carbon dioxide was liberated. So this was about the carbon dioxide and H2O additions, and that takes place in our body. I'll go to the next class now.